Good morning. Welcome to the Eastham, Planning Board meeting of January 17th. This meeting will be video recorded and broadcast over local access channel 8 and through the town website at www.eastham-ma.gov. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dan.
Yeah, the purpose of today, we don't have any cases today for our review, but we do have ongoing consideration of perhaps some modifications to the codes regarding the residential and commercial site plans that are going to be coming in, and some changes. One of the things I'm concerned with, and I don't know how you fellow board members feel, I don't feel comfortable getting locked into code requirements that say, for example, a house has to be situated on any given lot in a given way. I think we need to keep flexibility on that, because I don't feel that every situation that comes into the board is necessarily going to fit a code. I'll give one case example. Perhaps if a house came in and somebody felt it should be turned sideways in a side view from the road rather than a full frontal view, I think we have to have the full capability of deciding whether that's correct or not. I don't think that a code or shall we say, concerns from other people should mandate our approval. And having said that, that's just the way I want the code written. I want us to have the decision-making process without being told how we have to do something, review something. And I'm just thinking of, the last meeting and where we talked about perhaps turning houses and things like that. I'm not sure it fits. So I don't know how you board members feel. I just don't want to be in a position where we have to conform to a code when that decision is wrong for that particular site. That's all I have to say going in.
I agree with that, because no two lots of land are exactly the same.
Correct. Okay, with that, I'll turn it over to Paul or Phil, whoever's prepared to bring us up to date on some of the things you're considering. I know the last meeting we talked about, we had a great discussion on what's wet, what isn't wet, what's buildable, what isn't buildable. So I'll turn it over to, is it Phil or Paul that's going to do this at this point?
Bill's going to do it, but I guess I'll just preface. I just want to remind everyone. So what we're doing today is we are reviewing the bylaws that were already adopted last May. These are the residential site coverage, site plan review changes that were already adopted. So all of this stuff is already on the books. We're just doing a workshop so that everyone is familiar with it and we can work through any issues on how we apply the bylaw. There are pending changes to the bylaw for the commercial, but that is a whole separate item and we'll have separate meetings on those. So today is really just part 2 of the workshop we did on things that are already enacted. And the reason we wanted to do this, again, just make sure everyone's aware of, because there's a lot of new stuff. And even though we went over this last spring before the meetings, it's a lot. And now we're starting to get the first applications to planning board that are coming in fully under these new regulations. So we just want to make sure people were familiar with them. If there were questions or concerns on how we should be applying the bylaws, to Dan's point that he just made, that it's a good point. So we need to have that discussion. And that's basically what we're doing today. So feel free to ask any questions. We can always go back. Again, a lot of information, so we can go back and revisit things if we want to have follow-up sessions, because it's important that the board members are comfortable with the language and how to utilize them. So I'll turn it over to Phil and we'll.
All right, so you might recognize these slides because literally I just took the exact same presentation, but we were about 2/3 of the way through last time when we met at 4 o'clock in December. I actually did add a little bit more onto this after our December meeting, and we had that whole discussion about buildable upland and title stuff. So I put some slides in to clarify what I was trying to get across to the applicant and to everybody, but maybe didn't do such a good job of clarifying. So I put some stuff in there to talk about that. You might remember back earlier in the fall, we talked about revamping, maybe it was the late summer, revamping the application. And we had mentioned to the board that we were looking to roll out that new application to start of 2024. And we presented the application, the board had some feedback, so we made some changes. I provided that you have that there, and we'll go through that application together one more time, just so everybody has a chance just to look it over once more before it's like alive on the web. And I also provided you with a copy of a memo that we provided to the building commissioner, again, with respect to the title issue. So we'll talk about that when we get to it. I thought maybe we'd just really quickly go, I'm not gonna, we're not gonna go through each of these slides, but just kind of recap the whole conversation that we had last time. We started off highlighting the importance of the board's job of shaping the project and balancing the interests of, the applicant versus abutters versus town interests, and all the tools that we have available to do that built into the bylaw. So all those different criteria to consider. And so what we did last time is we went through each of these things talking about balancing the interests. So we had examples of landscaping, which the board's very familiar with, the different ways that a project can be shaped by adjusting landscaping. And then some of the specific requirements that are built into the bylaw regarding native vegetation, 6-foot buffer zones, things like that. We had some examples. And then this is where the conversation, I think, really we talked the most about prevailing character. So we had some examples of areas of neighborhoods that have sort of changed over the years as houses have been demolished and rebuilt, and sort of how the bylaw could or would have impacted some of these existing neighborhoods. So we talked about prevailing character. We talked about massing. So this was an example on over on the bay side of 2 houses, the bottom house actually being larger than the top house in terms of its site coverage and its net living area as well. But the top one appearing larger, and that the discussion was about massing and positioning of homes on lots and sort of utilizing the existing terrain and landscaping to alter the visual impact of a home. So we had that discussion as well last time. And that was the estimated site coverage on that home was 2,400 square feet, which was actually a little bit lower than this one, which was a little closer to 2,500 square feet. And these homes were, maybe a quarter mile away from each other, I believe, over on the bay side. And it was about here, I think, is close to where we left off in our discussion. I think maybe this slide maybe was still on the board. We had gotten into the conversation about shifting the layout of a home on a lot to perhaps reduce the visual impact, ways that could be done. I think we had a little bit of a conversation about a Aquamashad and that house, how that house was positioned on its lot, and the board proposing to shift the positioning of the garage back on that property to, again, reduce that. In that case, it's sort of the horizontal massing of that house, which was, whatever it was, 80 feet across on a, call it 100 and 110 foot lot, whatever it was, across. So ways to, again, reduce that visual impact to abutters and neighbors. What I don't think we really did get too much into last time, we kind of were in this topic as well, but we didn't really go down to this thing, was architectural techniques. And it sort of fits into the ongoing conversation we were having, but and ties right into what the chair was saying when he opened the meeting. Dimensions of the structure, orientation to the street. So again, the board's ability to shape the project to take a lot the way, take the shape of a lot and what's being proposed for a home on that lot and figure out ways to minimize that visual impact to an abutter, to passerbys, and to implement architectural styles and techniques that both match the existing neighborhood, but also kind of match the character of Eastham as a whole. And coming up with ways of using architectural techniques, having the builder come up with ways to mask potential, imposing features on a home. And this particular house is actually quite large, but when you are set back on the road, just the way, again, this is it's a lot of it's the product of this particular lot, the way the lot is shaped. The house was built in a certain way that the impact from the road is actually pretty minimal. And that lot kind of shapes from the driveway side kind of comes down on both sides. So it really kind of tunnels out, and it's pretty impressive how they fit that home onto that lot without it really being this big overpowering looking structure. Paul, did you want to say something?
Yeah, so before we adopted the new regulations, we had a set of guidelines that were developed like back in 2009. And they were basically best practices. They weren't in the bylaw, but they were best practices for how to design a residential lot. And so they talked, and so what we did last year was we basically took the language that were in the guidelines and put them into the bylaw so that they would have more force behind them. So when you go into the bylaw, into the section that talks about the planning board's review criteria, all the information that you all take into account, the landscaping, the prevailing character, height and scale, building materials, architectural techniques, all of that was always around. It was just not officially in the bylaw. And specifically to architectural techniques, this is where there is language that talks about the orientation of the building to the street. And the language that's in the bylaw, it says where feasible or applicable, the short dimension of the structure shall be oriented toward the street and garage doors oriented away from the street. Now, that doesn't mean that every single project has to be sited that way, because that's not going to be the right design for every project. But what it means is that the board can take that, it should take that into consideration when they're looking at the project. And it's perfectly fine to come to the conclusion, the board come to the conclusion and make a finding that in this case, it doesn't make sense for the site or how to fit in the neighborhood. So I guess I just want you to be aware that, there is language embedded in the bylaw. And so we have to take that into account, but it doesn't mean that the board doesn't still have latitude to shape the project. And that's what this always comes back to for residential projects, shaping the project, using the bylaw language, yes, but then looking at what the applicant's proposing. And the way I would look at it is, on the applicant side, they should be considering these things before they come in with a final design. They should look at it and they read the bylaw. It says they're basically, the town of Eastham is basically telling me as designer, architect, they want short dimensions. They want a certain, but let's look at the neighborhood. So that's where we're trying to get to. And as we outreach with architects and the folks that do a lot of work in town and homeowners, consider the neighborhood first before, and how are you going to be compatible with the neighborhood? Because if you want to do something completely different, the board could still see its way to approve that type of project, but the board's going to have to make findings to deal with these things. And so, like I said, it's always shaping the project in context with the neighborhood. So I guess there's still a lot of latitude for the board to make, to work with the applicant. And it doesn't mean that every single project has to be a certain way. It's just, we should be considering, would it actually be beneficial to twist this house the other way, or maybe have the garage facing away, or send the garage back to the end so that you have a more linear layout across. So all those things, just to say, you still have a lot of latitude, but we have to be cognizant of what's in the bylaw and basically just deal with it. The board can make a finding that says this is the best practice in the bylaw, but it's not appropriate, that's perfectly fine. That's what we should be doing. So,
I guess if I can interrupt, I'm looking at the application form on page 9. And on page 9, it says the short dimension of the structure is oriented toward the street and garage doors are oriented away from the street. Well, that's not saying to an applicant, we have flexibility. That's saying you want it that way, in my opinion, the way it's written. In other words, it's saying he has to answer that question. And perhaps the way it's written, he's thinking that if he wants to orient the long side along the street, he is in contravention to the code. And I don't feel that way. So, I just am concerned the way it's written, that it says almost like the short dimension shall be along the front. And I don't think that's an appropriate statement. And yet, and the other thing is, if you look at the slide that you have up on the board now, you're looking at a garage with a little garage with 2 doors in the house in the back. And my own personal opinion is that's not particularly attractive. If you were going to try to make that more attractive, you would turn the garage 90 degrees and put the doors so you don't see them from the street. The idea of looking at 2 garage doors with 2 cars in the front, and that's what you see from the street, in my opinion, is not attractive. So I'm concerned the way it's written, that the applicant is going to be basically defending a position that doesn't meet the code if he doesn't want to do this. How do we overcome that?
well, we have to, that is the language that's in the bylaw. But again, this language has always been with us. I mean, the best
I guess
practices.
it's just becoming more pronounced now on the application, and that's
Right.
okay. I didn't realize, look, I've been on the board a long time. I didn't realize verbiage existed that suggested that the short side of the house be oriented to the street. Because in my 40 years experience of doing site planning for residential and commercial buildings, the side end of the house is not usually the particularly attractive end. It's usually the front that somebody wants to make attractive. And the side becomes more or less utilitarian in its look, because there's not much you're going to do to the side other than have windows and a gable, perhaps. So, I'm surprised that this hasn't come up before as far as being a recommendation. It's just something I'm looking at and not necessarily agreeing with.
No, I understand. But what this is trying to get to is that the design of the house should be that the front of the house, the front door, the bay window, the front facade should be the short dimension. Not that you are going to have your garage door facing the street all the time, or that the side that doesn't have any architectural feature and your front door is going to face not the street. It's to consider that when you're designing the house, can you design it so the front door is located on the shortest dimension? And that, as I said, is not always going to be the appropriate design for the site and or the neighborhood, and that's fine. But that's what the guidance was always, and we put that into the bylaw. So on the application, what we're trying to do is, and maybe we can work on the language, but if you are filling out this application and you're not designing the house this way, you put no, but then you just put the explanation, like this isn't the right design because X, Y, Z. It's because it would stick out from the neighborhood, or the site is not. But then that way the applicant is explaining to all of us what their thought process was in the design. And again, it's perfectly fine for the board to say, yeah, you're right. So
would you have a problem adding another check mark question saying the long dimension of the house is oriented to the street? and having yes, no, and explanation on that. At least that puts an equal stress on long dimension of along the street versus short. And he would answer the question both ways. In other words, he would have another question saying the long dimension of the structure is oriented to the street, and then he'd have yes, no, and why. I mean, at least that way, in my opinion, it would be more reflective of his having to conform to the code, and he would be given an opportunity to express why he wants to have the long dimension along the road. This way, you're only defending or arguing for the short dimension. What's wrong with putting another question in and saying the long dimension and saying yes, no, and the explanation?
For purposes of the application, we can probably reword it, but the language in the bylaw is that the preferred design would be, when possible, orient the short dimension. And this is exactly the issue we confronted with the Aquamashad project. The design of that house did not align with the lot. It was a long, narrow lot. And they had a garage that was side by side with the house. And there was a lot of discussion about if they had simply narrowed the front facade, shortened it, put the garage to the back, a lot of the design issues and the neighborhood context issues would have been solved. And like this language in the bylaw, that's what it's trying to get at, so that somebody comes in with a design that is cognizant of that at the outset. And then the board is not in a position of trying to redesign a project.
Right.
Again,
I
this is
understand.
all, yep.
The only problem I have is, look at Quamashad. The end result is the short dimension of the house was not oriented to the street. What we did is broke up the front of the house to put the garage in the back, but the length of the house rather than the width of the house is what you see from the street. And I don't think that's wrong. We did make him put the garage back. We reduced the length to something less obtrusive, but we sure didn't put the side of the house oriented to the street.
I think, Paul,
Well, I guess,
with respect to the application, I think the jumping off point, I mean, the wording of that can be whatever. But for me, the jumping off point is the please explain box. If it's not conforming to the code as submitted, as you had said, that's the opportunity for the applicant to fill in that box and explain why not. And it's up to us on the board to focus on that explanation. And if the explanation is a good one, then we could be supportive of the application as it's submitted. Otherwise, I mean, that's obviously going to be an argument, or at least a discussion point. So I think we sort of take the application there as our guide, our jumping off point. And if it forces the applicant to think it through a little bit and have his arguments handy as to why the architect did it that way. And if the arguments are strong enough, then it's probably not much of an issue for us, but.
It may be a matter of too, in the application, we could always preface this section with a short paragraph that explains sort of what you just said, in a sense of that this isn't a series of these all check boxes have to be yes, but you have to explain that, whatever, we'll wordsmith this out, but you have to explain an answer for each of these things so we understand what we're getting, because that's really the most important part for it, is so that when these come in, that Paul and I are reviewing them, that we understand what the applicant's purpose and point is, what they're trying to do, so that we're not making, inferring something from their document when we don't really have much information, or why did they do this? We don't really know. We're trying to get them to flush that information out. So if we put a little paragraph at the beginning that says, for each of these things, please provide a description of your rationale for this, maybe that would clarify it a little bit or whatever.
Yeah, I think we can do that. And again, this goes back to shaping the project. Not every single checkbox has to be a yes, we're conforming, because not every project's a perfect match with your site, your neighborhood. So that's why it comes back to shaping the project, taking and trying to mitigate things that maybe aren't meeting the code by saying we're going to offset that with increased issues here, or we're changing the map, the orientation has to be this way because it's not the short dimension, but we're gonna, the massing or the height, whatever it might be, any combination of things to compensate for that. So I guess we can work on some language. I guess the other thing I would say is, obviously this issue, you know, seems to be of note. You know, if the board has strong feelings on these things, I mean, we can revisit it. And so it would be helpful to have, you know, if you feel like as a board, this language needs to be revisited again, that's perfectly okay too. We just need to
Well, if I might
acknowledge that and work on a possible amendment.
right, if I just might add, there couldn't have been more than a handful of applications in the last 10 years where the orientation was the side of the house to the street. It couldn't have been. And it's my take on that is people don't want it. I would argue that if you took the same question and added another question, so the first one would say the short dimension of the structure is oriented toward the street and garage doors are oriented away from the street. And the second question would be the long dimension of the structure is oriented to the street and garage doors are oriented away, and let them explain both. I think it would be appropriate to answer both questions rather than just the one. I don't know if my fellow board members feel that way, but at least that way, you're putting on the table the concern and you're letting them answer it not as a negative or a positive, but both questions have equal merit, shall we say. I'm just concerned that it's the way it's written now. I understand what you're saying, that you think the bylaw was amended in 2009, but I'm telling you right now, it's never been enforced, and I can't recall a handful of applications where it even applied. I mean, is there an issue putting a second question saying the long dimension is and yes and no and explain? Is that a problem in anybody's mind?
My recommendation would be that we could reword the question to be just broader, to say, please explain the rationale for the orientation of your project for the street. Just, and then it's not saying one or the other, but then they will explain that this is how we cited it to the street. But I guess the thing I want everyone to understand is what's in the bylaw is that the preferred layout, when possible, it says just when feasible, when appropriate, is that it's short dimension. So again, all the board has to do is determine that the short dimension is not appropriate. And if the application comes in that way, like we oriented it the long way towards the street because every other neighborhood, every other building in the neighborhood is that's how, you know, it's all ranch houses. Okay. That's fine. And the board can accept that. So again, just, it's not, the board is still free to consider that, but I think we can reword that. We can work on the wording in the application so it's broader. But again, I think if this keeps coming up, we should just discuss changing that language if you feel strongly about the, you know. But we can work on the language in the application.
Why don't we leave it that you'll come up with a revision to that particular question on the form, and let's see how we work with it.
Okay.
You understand my concern, so that's
I do.
where I'm at.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
we can definitely change the wording on that to make it
Okay,
more even.
all right, that point's done, now what?
All right. So next one, the good one. So the one that everyone kind of defaults to here is the site coverage. So when Paul and I were talking about having this workshop or a series of these with both planning board and the zoning board, we kind of got into this conversation about the importance of all those other points, because I think it's really very easy when we go down the road of reviewing these projects with applicants the site coverage stuff, the numbers are very black and white. It's clear cut. It's a pretty easy place for your eyes to go and to say, yes, no, like we're under the limit, we're over the limit. Yes, no, it's big, it's small, whatever. We meet a percentage, we don't meet a percentage. It's math. So the reason for putting this one towards the end was because it was to emphasize all those other things that are out there to consider as part of these projects, because you could very well have a house that doesn't go over the limit, comes in for review, is under the limit, but has a bunch of those other criteria that aren't being met, that needs assistance. It needs assistance from the board to shape the project. So, but there, of course, is the site coverage issue that needs to be talked about. And I think one of the other thing that sort of gets lost with the site coverage stuff is figuring out what sort of the threshold is going to be for a particular home in a particular neighborhood. So I think the Aquamashot example is a great one, not to keep going back to that project, but a lot of the homes in that neighborhood were fairly modest, fairly small homes. And that was a pretty large proposal that they had put in place. Had that home, for example, been on Sunset Lane in Bayshore, where the home from December, that would have fit in there quite well size-wise. It would have been right on, really pretty close to what's out there. And so when we're kind of trying to figure out what's an acceptable number, I think, one thing that Paula said to me a bunch of times is that when these applications come in, it's always going to be for a bigger home. I mean, it's going to be pretty rare, I think, that someone's going the other direction, and it's going to be a larger home. So we're just going to have to, as a board, figure out where we're going to set a threshold. Like, what's that percentage? What does the neighborhood look like? It doesn't necessarily, if the house is coming in and it's going to be the biggest in the neighborhood, how much bigger is it going to be? And coming up with being comfortable with what those numbers are, so that we're not necessarily setting a bar that's way, way above, so that the next person, we're going to have to find that it's going to be this gray area that's going to have to get worked through on all of these projects for these neighborhoods. So when we do the analysis and provide that information, when you go out there, when you drive through a neighborhood, that you're getting a feel for that existing character and the existing size, to help with this site coverage stuff. Because this is sort of I think it's one of these areas where we immediately say either yes, it fits, or no, it doesn't fit, or it's going to be the biggest. Okay, well, if it is the biggest, what does that mean? Like, is it the biggest by 1,000 square feet, or is it the biggest by 100? Okay, if it's the biggest by 100 and there's 10 other homes in the neighborhood that are close, then you're splitting hairs here. It's not that big of a difference. So it's going to be gray, and I think it goes with all of those other areas, that there's gray to all of this, that not much of this is going to be a perfect science. Like, it's going to be, as Paul again with me has used this analogy. I think my next slide even has it. I think it's a series of levers. Yeah. So like there is like a push and pull that has to happen on all of these projects. And even going back to the point about the orientation of a home on a lot, again, it's pushing and pulling these levers. It's as that in those check boxes, it's not that every single one of these things has to be yes. It's figuring out how to balance the yeses and nos to come up with a project that's acceptable and meets the general desires of the board and of the town. And and so each of these is going to be different. With the site coverage, the bottom point, I think, was something that I wanted to talk about for a second, which is that I think it's really pretty simple when these applications come in to say, oh, it's under the limit, it's through, it's fine. They didn't cross that threshold, they're at 12% or whatever, and the max is 15, they're fine. Just because they're under doesn't mean that there's not other stuff to be done to get that project more conforming to the character of the neighborhood. Again, all those things, massing, height. Mr. Hobbs.
I'm just confused in a sense. Let's just say you have a neighborhood and it has 1/4 acre lots, okay? But in the center, there's an acre lot.
Mhm.
And somebody wants to put up, what, a 3,000 square foot house or something on it. But all the other houses are, 900 square feet. Are you saying basically that guy, you can't do it? Even though he has the space to do it and the setbacks and all that kind of stuff?
Right. Well, for one, I mean, I'm not saying anything.
Well, no,
I'm just interpreting what the bylaw says, but I think the idea is that's a yes and no thing, because I think, no, ultimately the idea is to help get that house into that neighborhood in a way that isn't completely out of character with everything else that's there. So figuring out ways to minimize that impact as best as possible out of respect to the other homeowners. So it's not to say that, no, they can't come in and put in their 3,000 square foot home on that lot. No, that's not the idea at all. But they do have these, if that project comes before this board, they do have these criteria that they are responsible for trying to meet. So it might be, the size might be, seem much larger than everybody else. But if that applicant is able to meet these other criteria and figure out ways where he says, yes, this house it kind of goes back to that example of those two homes on the side of the road there. One is 2,400 square feet and it looks absolutely massive. The other one is 2,400 square feet and it's tucked down the hill and you can barely tell, right? So, I mean, it's going to be a matter of, does it fit in? And what are we doing to use the shape of the lot, the existing vegetation, the architectural styles, the height of the home, the massing, the positioning, all of these things, plus that site coverage. Does it work? And I think that's where it's the board's responsibility to try and tease that out and figure that out. And it's a hard job. Like, I don't think it's easy, but that's where I don't think it's a yes, no. Like, I don't think it's no, you can't put that there. At least that's my opinion on it.
But in that scenario where someone has a larger lot, and as long as they're under the site coverage limit, but they're gonna be the biggest house now. If they're compensating by the fact that they have a larger lot, they can site the house way back from the street or do any combination of things to mitigate it. So it really is not going to be affecting the character of the neighborhood from a public standpoint. That's where, the board could see it clear to approve that kind of project. Now, the next person that comes in and wants to do a project and they're going larger, and they may say, well, okay, I want, that person, you approve that one. Okay. But you have a smaller lot. You can't overcome, you want to have a same size house or even bigger, and I'm still under the threshold, but unfortunately you don't have that same size lot. You can't do the other things to overcome those issues to make it blend with the neighborhood, and that's going to be the issue. That's where, and it comes back to shaping the project. And every project's going to be a little bit different, but I think that's something to consider. And that's a way that someone could justify a larger house or a more abstract design than what's strictly in the neighborhood. Because, okay, yeah, if it's going to be back in the middle of the woods and no one's ever going to see it, that's a huge factor. Not everyone has that.
Paul,
Yes, sir.
I'm going to make a suggestion. We change the application process and make everybody have to come in for a pre-meeting before they go ahead and design their house. In other words, in part of the site plan application, an informal meeting must be done before the filing of a formal application on every single residential application. It's not fair to the applicant to have him design a house, come in and try to sell it, and in the 11th hour, we change it and make him do other things to it. He spent a fortune on architecture and everything else. If we're going to get that detailed in requirements of review of site plan approval for residential, I think it's mandatory every application comes in for an informal discussion. That's my opinion.
Is that in front of the board or in front of for the planning board folks?
The way you're going, I think it has to be in front of the board. I honestly, I'm struggling with this. It's not fair to an applicant where we have gray areas that we have to resolve. And he's out there hiring an architect at thousands and thousands of dollars. And we turn around and say, well, we don't think it fits the bylaw, so therefore go change your house. It's too late. I think if we mandated that they come in for an informal review and flush out these overall concerns, we're talking about planning concerns that are going to affect his house design. I think we have a responsibility as the planning board to flush those out before he goes and spends his entire cost of hiring an architect and doing everything else under the sun, when we have, shall we say, subjective ideas that we want to implement into the site plan. I don't think it's fair to the applicant not to do that. Now, I realize it means he has to come to an extra meeting, but think of the valuable information he's going to get if he comes to the meeting early. And we have a strong feeling about orientation, and we have a strong feeling about character of the neighborhood, and we have strong feelings about what we want. If we're going to get that detailed on these applications, I think it's only fair that the applicant has to come in and talk to us before he gets going. I don't know how the rest of the board members feel, because it's going to be a lot more work, but I think in the long run, it's going to be less work because he'll know how we feel before he gets into the design of the whole thing. How do my board members feel about that?
I think that would save a lot of grief at a later date if they did that.
Paul,
would
do you see any? Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. Didn't mean to cut you off.
I mean,
Go
I
ahead,
would
Dave.
agree as well, although I mean, I almost come back to the point where you're gonna buy a lot, you ought to know specifically what you can put on there. And it's like, where do you stop in a sense? You buy an acre lot, you say, well, I can put up X, Y, Z, but then there's all these other things that say you can't. I don't think it's fair to the person to let that person buy the lot thinking that he can do this. So I'm not sure where you end.
Presumably, architects and local real estate people should know that what the requirements will be, in general, at least.
In general.
Yeah, and I think, we have been working to push that information out there. And I mean, the good thing is it's not like it's kept under lock and key. I mean, the information is freely available for anybody to, if you do your due diligence on this and we do get questions, I feel like all the time about
From-
this stuff.
from real estate agents
Developers,
and
real estate, all the
developers,
time
yeah.
about site coverage stuff, and they are asking questions about it. So I don't think it's a complete mystery to them. And one of the things that is one of the bullet points in the presentation here is also the idea of discussing, and I think Paul's encouraged this a lot, is having more preliminary visits with people, whether it's formally, informal in front of the board, or whether it's coming in and talking to one of the two of us or both of us to go over this stuff a little bit so that they're not running into exactly the situation the chair described there, where they've spent so much money up front. I don't know about the legality of requiring it, though. Paul can speak to
No.
that.
We can definitely put in a requirement for a preliminary review. That's not a problem. You have to do that as part of a subdivision. You have to have a preliminary plan and a review, so that can definitely be done. And like I said, in the interim, we are encouraging that always voluntarily for right now. But I guess the thing I want to just make sure everyone understands is the site, all of this review criteria has been in the bylaw since 2007. So when you go to the zoning bylaw, pages 85 and 86, there's five numbers there. And those are the review criteria that have been on the books this whole time. And they talk about all of these issues. The only thing that's changed is we added bullet points under each of these numbers, almost all these numbers, to try to draw more specific attention to these items. And the idea was to get more specific so that we could set clear expectations for someone that's designing a project. Like the board has always had to take into account height, scale, massing, setbacks, materials, screening, architectural techniques, and they've always had to take into account the prevailing character of the buildings. The only thing that we did was we added bullet points to say, this is what we actually mean by this. We're talking about the prevailing character. We're talking about height and scale, and we've tried to add in some to again, give better guidance and set the expectations so that hopefully the architect, the engineer, the homeowner is reading this. And so that they know what the expectation is before they've spent a lot of time and money on this. But this language has been in the bylaw for years. And Eastham is different. Not every town has residential site plan review. Very few do. Eastham does and has since 2007. And, I made this point the last time. For good or ill, that's what the town bylaws were adopted in 2007. And every single time they've gone to the town meeting to be clarified, strengthened, specified, they've been approved. And so that has been the approvals that have gone through at town meeting, and the burden now falls to, staff and the planning board to implement them. So
Well,
that's to
I
say,
guess- yeah.
but if the board feels strongly that there's some problems with these, then that's part of our job too. We can identify those and say, these are problem areas that we need to go back and amend. And if the board feels that way, part of Phil and I's job is to help you deal with that. And we will do that.
I'd have no
Well-
problem with Dan's suggestion about if means we see more cases early on, that's fine. I think a lot of it is communication more than anything else.
Yeah.
If you hear it from that preliminary discussion from staff and so forth, that, okay, yes, you've got site coverage limits. However, there's other issues relative to prevailing character and whatever else. Hopefully they're getting that message. And that's being conveyed to the architects. I mean, trying to think through the process a little bit. Someone sees a lot they want to buy, they want to get a house that's has certain features to it, your wish list. And I feel they can get that fine. They'll probably at least have preliminary discussions with an architect about, okay, I'm looking to buy this lot that's X number of square feet. I like to have this, and this at the house. Is that feasible? And they tend to go to the site coverage numbers and say, well, yeah, it seems to fit the scale. And they're not thinking of the other factors very much. So I think the sooner that you get that information out there to them. And I think from your point, Paul, about this has been part of the bylaws for a long time, and that's true. Having served on the housing task force a year ago and before this was being presented in May, there was some discussion there basically about, yeah, that stuff's been on there for a long time, but is it emphasized? It should be carrying a little bit more weight because people felt that it wasn't getting enough attention to it. So I think the more we can do to educate the public, the architects, certainly the applicants, the better, so that when they come in with the formal presentation, hopefully the wheel has been greased and everyone's happy with the results and we've met the criteria here. And, if not, at least it won't be a surprise to them. If they didn't put enough emphasis on a particular feature when we warned them, I don't want to see people wasting money either. But at the same time, if you give them the information over and over and they choose to ignore it, that's their call. But it's communication. So if it needs another meeting, that's fine by me.
Are you saying that you already do that to a large degree?
We have been encouraging everybody to come in for a preliminary, like say, it's not required in the bylaw, but we've basically saying, this, even if it looks pretty straightforward, we should just come in for a preliminary and just shake out any issues. And, and it's not even that there's something in the bylaw. It just may be a board member may have a certain take on it that's not in the bylaw or not, and it might be a really great point that could change the project. It's good to just get that out there. So yes, we've been we can't require it at this point, but we've basically been saying it's in your own best interest to come in and we don't require that they have any fancy plans or anything. It's just informal and just at least get a sense of what the project is, and if there's any red flags, we can let them know.
So what you're saying is that Dan's proposal is optional now?
It is because we don't have anything that,
Is it stated in the, I mean, and stated, so.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
defined in the book, like it is a formal thing.
yeah. But
Well,
in
Paul,
the,
we have-
in the
we have
special,
the-
sorry, go on.
We have the right, because the applications are our purview and do not, this application paperwork does not go to town meeting. We have the right to require an informal discussion with the board prior to the filing of a formal application. We can certainly have that requirement without going to town meeting to change anything. Is that correct?
No, I think we would need to put that into the bylaw to have it like a mandatory.
Why
And
couldn't
that's-
we put it in the application?
The application is, well, the application doesn't have the force of the bylaw behind it. We can definitely put language in there that says, strongly recommend in your own best interest, all that stuff as an interim measure. But like
Well, I
in the
guess
other
if we put that
section,
as-
sorry,
Yeah, I guess if we said to them, I'm thinking, again, back the last 10 years, we've never used the short dimension criteria, ever. And it's never come up. And so it's only fair to say to somebody, we're now having these new issues, and do you want to come to the board and talk about them before you go ahead and design? I can take Dave's point. A guy buys a lot. He wants to build a ranch house. He wants to orient it to the street. If the planning board required him to turn it sideways, he wants to walk away from the purchase of the lot. Well, he should be able to do that before he buys the lot. So my concern is, if we're going to mandate something that turns off the applicant to the extent that he no longer wants to buy the property, we have an obligation to tell them now before he gets involved in all this stuff. That's my concern. Dave's point's well taken. You got an option to buy a lot. Well, what can you do in the lot? Well, I could build a house that's lengthwise along the street. Well, maybe you can't, because this point, and this is the only one I can think of. This point says you can't. So he's going to say, well, I don't want it. Now, it'd be terrible and probably a subject of a lawsuit if he came to this board and we denied it based on the fact that it's not turned 90 degrees to the short side to the street. We're going to get sued. He's going to have a lot he doesn't want to build on. I just don't like this looseness that the board has, these abstract requirements that were considered in 2009 that we have never enforced in the past. And now suddenly we're enforcing them, and it's affecting people's desire to build. It's just bothering me. And
well,
so
it doesn't say that you can't. It just says
No.
where feasible or applicable. And all the person has to say is, I want to build a ranch house because everything else in the neighborhood is a ranch house, or whatever the reason is. Doing otherwise would make this not fit into the neighborhood character. And the board, I would assume, would see the logic in that, and that would be a reasonable finding to make. We are not enforcing the short dimension because it's not suitable based on the neighborhood, based on the lot, so there's nothing in there that says they have to. I guess I understand what you're saying, and there's merit to it, but I don't read this bylaw as saying, if I build this house, I have to make the short dimension. It's not, it says where applicable or feasible. What that says to me is that, yes, you have to, Eastham has residential site plan review. Other
then
towns do
maybe-
not.
Then maybe you should modify, we're going to get back to this language. You should modify, Phil's going to modify the question, because right now it says the short dimension shall be oriented towards the street. It doesn't say where feasible. It doesn't say where applicable. It doesn't say that it doesn't have to be. It just says it should be. So maybe it's the wording on the question that we're gonna have to overcome more than anything else. But concerning applications, I would be surprised, I'll use the term surprised, if we don't have the right to require an informal application before the filing of a formal application. I just have never seen where you need a bylaw change to enforce such an action, but I'm willing to defer to the experts.
Well, I'm not an expert. I'm happy to ask town council. If I'm wrong, then that's great. That's actually be better. But I think we need to have it in the bylaw, but I will ask and
Okay.
I will verify.
All right, we might as well drop this because Phil's gonna work on language. This is not the only one. I'm sure there are other sections in here that perhaps need some tweaking. So Phil, I'll leave that in your hands.
Sure. I think,
Okay.
and not to beat on this point, but I am going to add one last thing, which is that the preliminary stuff is really good. But there is a sort of a loophole in there or an issue with that, which is ultimately this is triggered by the building commissioner reviewing a building permit and potentially already having had all of that work done, before. We don't always get the case where someone comes in way ahead of time and does their due diligence. Like you had Mr. Swain, who did a great job reaching out to the department well ahead of time, asking about the feasibility of his project before he went down the road of building plans and all of that stuff, and then worked with the board and worked with the building commissioner and with Paul and stuff to kind of flush all that out. But that doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes a project comes right into Justin, correct me if I'm wrong, right? A project comes in, he reviews it and says, oh, you got to go to planning board. And they've already done that stuff. So really it comes back to Mr. Gatlin's point there of like, communication is pretty much the biggest piece to this, is us putting out the word as best we can to local builders, architects, having them more familiar they get with these bylaws, to know to ask these questions before they go down this road, as much as possible. So anyway.
Well, I think you and Paul have the expertise. If somebody comes in to talk about this before they actually file an application, to give them proper advice.
Right.
So the only thing happens is, and perhaps it's buyer beware. If the guy comes in without having talked to you about it and just jams it in, submits it, that's his risk.
Do you have anything else on site coverage? No.
Can we go? Let's go on.
All right, we're gonna go on.
Levers. We got levers.
We got levers. So anyway, we're just sort of beating this up here, but balancing the interest. So really, as like I said, as Paul has said to me multiple times as we've talked about this, it really is, and I really like the analogy that it really is sort of pushing and pulling levers here. That they're not all going to face in the same direction for every single one of these projects, right? Some are going to be up, some are going to be down, and you're going to move them around to figure out how to get these projects to fit in. So, and the last point there is really we're trying to do with the reviewing of the application as best we can is get as much information as possible from our applicants so that they're doing their part to help us understand the project and the rationale behind it. And really, if you think back to December, I thought the folks, just my personal opinion, I thought the folks from Sunset Ave and Bay Shore there had a really good presentation, had really thought stuff through, and really spoke to a lot of the points in the application process about the character, about the shape of the house, about the architectural style they were using, why they were doing the demo. They had all that information ready to go and were ready to answer those questions. And that makes it so much easier to make decisions on these things.
Agreed.
All right, so that last slide there, this one was sort of the end of where we had left off, where we would have, if we'd finished last time, that where we would have finished. So, and if you remember back last in December, we had the whole conversation with the folks from Sunset and Bay Shore there regarding the size of their lot and the whole conversation about buildable upland, and it went into the high water stuff. So after that meeting, Paul approached me about coming up with a memo to try and strengthen that up. And then we talked a little bit about what we would do going forward. And sort of step one for me was to make sure that I got some clarification to the board about some of this stuff. So I figured this was a great opportunity to do this. So I've got a handful of slides here that talk about this and hopefully provide some clarity. So the first 2 points here, these are the definitions of these things right out of the bylaw. So site coverage, which we were just talking about, if you read up on site coverage in the definition, it makes specific reference to the lot area. So when you're determining your site coverage ratio, it's based on lot area. So the definition for lot area, that highlighted area is the key on this. So it talks about all kinds of different things with respect to water, marshes and swamps and creeks and bogs and all that good stuff. And it has this language in here about areas subject to flooding from high tides. And so when that project from Bayshore came in, and I saw where they had marked the line of the property, it kind of raised a flag in my head because I thought, oh, I know this location, like that's not buildable there. Like I knew that much. So it got me thinking. I started digging into this a little bit more to figure out what the best approach would be going forward. So here's the definitions for site coverage and site coverage ratio. So it's based off a lot area. So when we look at lot area, I provided this when we met, I think maybe in August, or we had a workshop one other time. So the area on the right there, that example on the second, you would have to, for calculating your lot area, you have to take out those unbuildable areas. So those areas, so let's imagine you had a small bog or a little bit of marsh, or you had part of, whatever it might be, a river running through your, all the rivers that exist in Eastham, right? Running through your property, you have to remove that area from your buildable to determine your lot area, which is going to impact your site coverage, the amount of house that you can kind of put on your lot. So you could essentially have a piece of property with the exact same dimensions, which those two would be there, and one of them could have significantly less buildable or lot area that's for site coverage, that buildable area. And the case with Bayshore and Sunset was really the first time I've seen it a couple times, but that was like the strongest example I had seen of a potentially significant portion of a piece of property being questionable, whether it was buildable or not buildable. So these were the terms. I'll go walk us through these, and it'll, I think, make sense by the time I'm done. These were the terms I was kind of trying to throw out there when we were talking. So what they had provided to us was the bottom one there. So you'll see that MHW, mean high water. So as you know, I think you go down to the bay, if you go over to First Encounter Beach and you stand there, if you stood there for 24 hours, you're going to see the tide come in, it's going to go out, it's going to come back in, it's going to go back out, and you're going to see 2 high tides and 2 low tides in a 24-hour period, right? 6 hours, roughly 6 hours between each one. Mean high water takes all of the high tides, and so every tide has a height value assigned to it. So, which is like some days you go there and it's high tide and the water's pretty far down the beach. You're like, oh, there's actually a lot of beach here. You go there a different day on high tide, and maybe it's a full moon, water's almost up to the parking lot, and you're like, wow, it's high tide, and there is no beach here today. Mean high water takes all of those high tides and averages those together, the values, the heights, and says, okay, mean high water, the average of all of those tides is this point right here, okay? Every time those 2 high tides that happen in a day, we have a diurnal tide cycle. So what you actually have is one of those tides is always higher than the other, always, okay? So one of those, in the different times in the calendar, the discrepancy is bigger and smaller. So there are times in the calendar in a month when the discrepancy can be 3 to 4 feet between the one high tide and the other high tide. Sometimes they're much closer, it depends. But so there's another term that sort of NOAA scientists, however you want to describe this, calculate the high water, and it's that second one, it's mean higher high water. So what they do is they say, no, we're not going to look at we're not going to look at all of them. We're going to look at those top ones that happen every day. And we're going to make a calculation based on those top ones, which is a higher number. So you end up with that second term, which is kind of confusing. It's mean higher high. So they're taking the higher of those two every day. They're averaging them out over a long period of time. And they're saying this is the average of that higher one that happens every single day. There is a third term. There's actually tons of these, but there's a third one that we talked about last time, and it's called highest astronomical tide. So that basically is, if without considering the weather, without considering the wind or storms or any of that stuff, if you had a full moon or a new moon and it was at its strongest cycle that it can possibly be at, what is the highest value that the moon and the sun and the earth can work together to, where can they put that water as the highest astronomical tide that they can calculate for a location? And they actually do a calculation. They base it over like 40 years. So the highest astronomical tide right now for our area is actually a date that's in 2034. They've done that calculation. They say from 10 years ago to, because they do it over these 40-year chunks, and that's how they calculate it. So they figured out what mean high water is, what highest astronomical tide is. And it's a date, and it's in 2034, and the water will be at its highest point that the moon and the sun can work together to make it. There'll be plenty of times between now and then that it'll get awfully close, but that is like, splitting hairs. When you get down to it, there's actually a date, and they know exactly where that line is. All right. And that's a calculable thing for every single tidal location that exists around the globe. They can do this calculation. And so when that proposal came through, it came through at the bottom one there, the mean high water, which is essentially one of the lowest places that you could start from. Aside from saying low tide, which we all know we couldn't do that, right? Obviously you can't say, oh yeah, I'm going to count, a mile out onto the flats as part of my property. Wouldn't work. So I have some visuals of these so you can see how this works. So this is sort of the, imagine that kind of 24 hours, a little more than 24 hours here, but this is just like a chart. So here's your you've got multiple high tides in there over a couple day period. These are just sort of made up numbers. But imagine that the first one's at 6 a.m. in the morning. It's an 8.5 foot tide. So how do they calculate that? So I mentioned in that meeting that we had in December that we have two locations that we base this off of for us. And they basically kind of do some math between Provincetown and between Dennis. This is Seward Harbor, and they're not averaging them together, but that's how they use those points to help determine what our area is here, like on the Bayside and in Eastham and Wellfleet and so forth. And so there's 0, which is like the lowest of the low water, and then the tide goes up. So if you go to like Rock Harbor at dead low tide, that's sort of a 0. You can kind of use that as your baseline. When the water comes up to the top of those pilings at Rock Harbor, that is like an 11 foot tide. That's that 11 foot range that we're talking about. So 8.5, 9, 10, whatever the number is, every location, every day has that tidal range, right? So you'll see in this sort of made up example that you have one number, and then it's 12 hours later, you have a second high tide, but it's higher than the first one, right? So if you did that mean high water, it would be sort of the average of all of those, right? If you did the mean higher high, it's going to take those two highest ones and average them together. And then there's that third one, which would be that highest astronomical, which you may not reach in any given year, but those are the real big moon tides and the highest of that one, right? This is an actual example right now. This is Provincetown. So you can see that variation day to day. So if you look, you'll see every single day, on each of the highs, one is significantly higher than the other, right? And so that's that calculation. So that's the difference between those two numbers. So you'll see on one of those, kind of hard to read, but one of those is reading 11 feet right in the middle there. That tallest one in the middle is reaching 11 feet. The one to its left, 6 hours earlier, or 12 hours earlier, I'm sorry, is 9 feet. So that's like a 2 foot difference between those two tides. And so when we look at this from a land perspective, 2 vertical feet this way can be a lot horizontally going that way. right? Because depending on the slope of the land, right, if you go up 2 feet, who knows how far you're gonna go before you hit land again. So that's why this matters. And so here's sort of a visual example of this. So if we take that mean high water, we say, let's say it's 9.6 feet, there's your house, not to scale here because that would be like a 8-foot house. But let's say that the chart on the right part is sort of to scale. So if at a 9.6 mean high water, there's your buildable upland based on our definition, because it would say, okay, subject to flooding. Well, flooding at high tide, there's the high tide line. We're going to say that that's our buildable upland. If you do the calculation based on mean high water, it shifts up a little bit. You know, now it's up to 10.2 feet. We've lost that between that area there, those two big red markers there is sort of the chunk of land we've lost in our buildable upland, because now we've said it's mean high water. Then the third one would be, oh, it's a 12-foot tide. So you've lost that entire area, and our buildable upland is this. And so when we met with Bayshore, when they came in and they had their calculations, we ultimately with them went with the second one there, the mean high, because they had at least done that calculation, and it seemed at the time the reasonable, fair way to do it, right? Ultimately, though, going forward, it would be sort of my recommendation, I think, that the definition go to that highest astronomical tide level, because that level, you're going to get very close to that almost every month. And you are going to get there in any 40-year chunk of time, you're definitely getting there. And anytime you're getting a storm, you're going way past that level. So that's not a marker that is unreachable. It's getting very close to that every month. And then anytime you've got a good storm, it's probably cresting past it. So it's not getting into flood zones, you know, because there are, I think Chatham, maybe there are towns, I think, where you can't, if you're in the flood zone, you can't do anything. Like you're not, you know, there's no more building at all. So we didn't go down that road with calculating the buildable upland, but it eliminates at least the questionableness of this, you know, kind of says, okay, here's the highest where it's going to go on an average, and we're not going any lower than that. So I think that's sort of a visual representation of that. So what I did, and forwarded along to Paul for review, is put together a memo, and I provided you guys with a copy of it to use that highest astronomical tide as the boundary to calculate the lot area until such time that either the definition in the bylaw gets adjusted. If we want to go that route, again, that's beyond my pay grade as to how that gets done. But the idea was to at least give our building commissioner some ammunition, so to speak, so that when something comes in, there is a baseline to make a decision on something like that. So we're not sort of making a random decision going forward. So we have some kind of basis to go off of. So we did put that together, and it basically takes exactly what I just showed you and puts it into words, and then would provide some kind of background for a builder to work off of. So that's the memo. Any questions on any of that stuff? Does it
I
make
did
any
have-
more sense?
Why don't we care about what the storms bring? I mean, do we want somebody to build a house where it's going to get blown away by, you know, just a good nor'easter?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know the history of the.
Well, I mean, what we're talking about is calculating, it's not so much where the house is going to be, but how much land you have to base your size of your house on.
Okay,
So so I would say that'd be a definite red flag if you were proposing to put it in a danger zone. And there's other factors that would mitigate that anyways. I mean, the building code has restrictions on that. If we're talking about that sort of area, you're going to be getting into Conservation Commission jurisdiction, and they would prohibit.
okay.
So this is really trying to get to someone I want to build a house. We have site coverage limits now. What is the size property? What is the size of the lot that I can factor into how big my house is, really getting at? And the language we have now, it just says you can't count areas
Subject. to-
subject to high tide flooding.
Okay.
And that, as we saw, we didn't anticipate that that would be an issue, but now we see, there's many ways to calculate it. So in the absence of like kind of black and white language in the bylaw, the building commissioner, as the zoning enforcement officer, has to, he's gonna have to make a zoning interpretation. So if someone came in and said, here's my project, and he's looking at it and said, well, you're gonna have an issue with your site coverage calculation. How'd you calculate this? Oh, mean high water. Then so all of this is to say, we were trying to use the best logic and best science data available to say, in the interim, here's some guidance that we can provide to the building commissioner so that he can make a reasonable judgment call until such time as we get this straightened out and put something black and white in the bylaw. And so we wanted to revisit this with the board to get your feelings, if you think this makes sense, if this is a reasonable approach. Again, it's ultimately up to the building commissioner. He's got to make his own determination. But personally, I think it makes sense to have a basis for this. And if the commissioner knows the planning board thinks this is reasonable, the zoning board thinks it's reasonable, it's all good backup for us. Because again, someone may call into question, an engineer may say, I don't think this is right. But at least we have our rationale and our logic behind us to. So long way of saying, this is why we're bringing this all back to you. So
Well, I guess I have a couple of
I
questions.
just say, if anyone has any technical questions,
Yeah.
that's definitely Phil. But if you have any feelings about it in general, if you feel like this isn't a reasonable approach, it'd be helpful for us to know that, and we can go forward.
Well,
I
I
think
guess,
it's a good approach. Again, it takes away the discussion that we had back in December. And in their case, it worked out because the numbers still worked at the middle level there. But it's something I think it may come up as more of an issue as time marches on here. With water levels rising and all that stuff. I don't know if anyone's been to Coast Guard Beach the last 4 or 5 days. It didn't look that way a week ago. They lost a lot over there. And I think you're gonna see more and more of that.
Is this something that you want to vote on, for instance?
I don't think it needs a vote, but that's totally up to the board. I think if, like I said,
Make it easier.
it's not gonna make anything like full enforcement. Ultimately, the commissioner's gonna do what he feels, but I think it's helpful to know where the board's, yeah, we agree with this rationale.
But is it helpful to sell it basically if there's a vote was taken and it was whatever the numbers turn out to be versus just saying, oh yeah, we discussed it and they kind of liked it?
I'm hesitant to have you vote only because then that people might get confused about that. So I guess I would just say it'd be helpful to know kind of informally that, acknowledge that we ran this by the board, and even informally, if everyone felt this is the right approach. Yeah,
so Paul,
Dan, what do you think?
all right. Paul, do you think that if this is,
You're
first of
muted.
all,
You're muted.
I think we have rationale that says,
Dan,
highest-
you're on mute.
I'm on mute? I didn't put me on mute, hold on. I'm not muted.
Oh, no, maybe it's something on our end.
You can't hear me?
Wayne might be able to help us
I
out.
think he cut me off because I was talking too much before. Wayne?
Ah, okay. Good dear.
Can you hear me, Wayne? No? Yo, Wayne. I have video and audio on.
Wayne's working on it.
Okay,
He's trying to get the audio back.
okay.
That'll teach him to go to Florida in the middle of January.
Yeah, how dare I? Not yet?
Hi, Dan, this is Wayne. Can you hear
Yeah.
me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. It's not in the room, so I'm still working on it. Thanks.
Okay, not a problem. Well, it is a problem.
Oh, there he is.
There we
There
go.
you are.
You're back.
Remember my
here's-
brilliance, Dan. Thanks.
I'll remember, yeah, I'll remember, all right. Okay, I think we are justified in determining that the highest astronomical tide meets the criteria of not, of subject to flooding. You know, the last application on Sunset, we ended up at the mean high water or whatever it was. But I do think if this is what we're going to do, that we're going to need to put it in the definitions, which will probably have to be voted on in a town meeting, where we say, well, when we define areas of flooding or high water, or whatever that code says, I think we need to pull this definition into it so that everybody understands it. But I would have no problem enforcing it now based on the highest astronomical tide.
So what we could do is we just could do a simple housekeeping article and insert this text in there, and that would basically straighten it out.
Okay, I don't see anybody arguing. Of course, anybody can argue with anything. The applicant on Sunset argued, but I can't see how anybody could successfully argue that the highest astronomical tide doesn't reflect what gets wet. It just doesn't, it's not
Yeah.
logical that it doesn't.
And that was the whole crux of the discussion. At that meeting was like, the intent was, we don't want you to count areas that are wet at high tide. And
Right.
we
And
just
it
need to be
will,
more specific.
and it will cut down on the buildable land, which will also cut down on the size of the potential house, potentially. Okay,
All right, I think that was it for that section. It's 5:30. Let me quickly bring up the application. How can I get back to my sharing screen?
To expand. Oh, it's gonna be on here. Oh, go with that arrow.
There we go. Yep, perfect. Thank you. So you all have a copy of the application in front of you. So this was the same. We only made some minor changes. We brought this before the board back in the fall. As I mentioned earlier, the board did have some feedback on a couple of sort of more minor things. I think the major change since then, the board had asked for, originally, I think I had in under the explanation section here, I think it said I had if yes, please explain. The board had asked for just please explain on any of these. We talked already about the need to revise that question with respect to orientation and perhaps adding some language into the beginning of this about the sort of importance of yeses and nos and why we need an explanation on each of these. The application is definitely longer than it was, but I don't think it's any more challenging. I think and really ultimately for the board's sake and for staff's sake, it'll flush out a lot more information. Because it goes through sort of line by line on the bylaw and pulls out all the points that we've been discussing here, that we discussed in December and again today. Each of these things, and gives the applicant an opportunity to explain yes or no, why or why not something's being done a certain way, so that we have the rationale to then explain that. And then that goes into, again, back into those findings of fact, where we can say, yes, this was done this way, no, this wasn't done this way, and here's why we believe this, and so on and so forth. The application is now all, electronically fillable. It does do all the calculations for the applicant, so they can add all this stuff up. The site coverage calculator, which we went through, I'm not sure that I think last time it had been asked that I add this to it. I'm not sure. I don't remember if that was in there the last time. So this is the chart right out of the bylaw on the site coverage, and then the site coverage calculator is built right in. So the applicant can enter their existing site coverage, they can enter their lot size, and it's going to do the calculation for them, tell them whether they are over or under that limit. And then they've got that number right there for them. So they know, and the chart right above it that makes reference to it. Everything else that's in there, these are all now do the calculations as well. It'll calculate that coverage ratio for you. So they'll get the percentage then again. So that way, when these applications come in to us, we're getting the calculation right there from the numbers. We don't have to go and try and do it ourselves or whatever. Trying to think, if there's anything else that's changed. Oh, this is more of like a housekeeping thing under the review determination. We did break that out. So basically, we tried to come up with all the different ways. So this is page
11.
6. Yeah, maybe 6. The review determination there, basically all the different ways that an applicant could end up needing site plan residential review. So those are all the different criteria that are sort of built into the bylaw. So it's all the same stuff that was in the other one. It seems like a lot more. It's really not. It's just that in the older application, some of these things were sort of in a paragraph together. So I just took them here and broke them apart, because it was actually just more so because it was easier for my brain. I don't know. For some other people, it might have been easier the other way. I don't know. But ultimately, it's just all these different ways that a project could come in for review and then end up in front of the planning board. And so those are all those criteria right there. And I think that's it on the application. I don't think anything else has changed since the last time we met.
I think that the last meeting, the application on Bayshore and Sunset, they did a really nice job with providing the board with some detail. They addressed the building materials, they addressed how the design fit in with the neighborhood, they explained, and, they did it, and I think that was just kind of like what we hope to get each time. And so they can always give it, they did it in a narrative, so I think the most important, as long as we get the information. So some of the stuff's not gonna fit in the little box here, but that's fine. It's just, as long as they use that to say, oh, answer these questions, so that staff and the board doesn't have to guess at what they're trying to accomplish. So that's really just trying to get complete applications that don't have kind of throwaway one line answers. Like the question is, how does this fit in with the neighborhood? It's like, you've seen them. Sometimes the answer is the building is designed to fit in with the neighborhood. It's like, okay, but how? And we're trying to make sure we get some actual info there. So.
Let me throw out an idea I have. At the bottom of page 1, could we add a line saying the date you met with planning staff? Underneath where it says, if yes, list the numbers and book and page numbers. Do we want to mandate that they, or at least suggest that they meet with you by putting a line in there that says the date the applicant met with the planning staff? Do you want to commit? Do you even want to do that? Are you willing to do that if we put it in there and sort of suggested that that's what they do?
I guess I would, if we wanted to do something like that, I would say we should put in a note saying, preliminary staff review strongly encouraged, blah, blah, blah. And we could put a note saying, have you met have you met with staff? If yes, date. Because we can't, I don't,
Okay.
until I
that's
know
fine.
that we can actually require that,
No, I think what you just said is fine.
then everyone's on notice of like, you didn't bother to meet with staff, so if you come in with a plan and we're really redrawing things,
Right.
at least everyone's on.
I would be comfortable with that, what you just said. That's fine. Board members, do you agree?
I agree.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think we made progress. Thank you both for your help today. This has been tremendous, actually.
Well, thank you, and we appreciate you coming in for these extra meetings, and there will be more with the new
I'm
zoning.
sure.
So we do appreciate it, and the feedback is great. The discussion was great. I know some of this is not easy, and there's, people have different views on it, but as long as we can keep the dialogue going, and at the end of the day, Phil and I are here to help the board get through these regulations and help you work with them. And I
Right.
think it's an ongoing process, and I just really encourage that, if you feel like I don't think we should ever shy away from revisiting the bylaws. As we get working with them, we uncover things that just aren't right. That's all perfectly fine. And so that's part of the process. So identify things and tweak it and make it work as best we can.
Well, Paul, I think you said we're going to have bylaw changes coming up for May's town meeting.
Yep, so all of this is a major reworking of the commercial corridor bylaws.
Right.
The substance isn't changing as much as the formatting. And again, we're trying to streamline things. We're trying to build into the bylaw specific performance standards and architectural standards so that everything's laid out. And so the designers will know, like, this is what the expectation is, and you come in, and if you're meeting those, there really won't be too much to discuss, hopefully. And so that's really the crux of what we're working on. And the zoning task force is working on that. I'm planning to have a workshop. I just mentioned this before, but workshop on February 21st. I know everyone won't be able to get that, but I think that's going to work for the majority. So I'm trying to do planning board, zoning board, the task force, and invite the select board in. We did this last year too, and it worked pretty well. So we'll have that. We have to work through the Cape Cod Commission and get their approval because this zoning falls under their purview.
Is that at 1 PM?
On the 21st, we'll be at 10.
10.
Yes,
What day of the week is that?
Wednesday. It's the same day as, Wednesday. And then we will have our formal public hearing in March.
Thank you.
So bear with us as we work through all of this important stuff.
Is that it?
That's it for me.
We have minutes here.
We do have minutes.
Oh, you want a
Yeah.
minute?